Think about it for a second. When a hurricane slams a coast, or a pandemic sweeps the globe, or the power grid just goes down, it feels like pure chaos, right? But behind the scenes, there's this massive, almost invisible architecture that's designed to bring order to that chaos. Well, today, we're going to pull back the curtain on that national blueprint for disaster response, the systems and strategies built to manage the absolute worst-case scenarios. To really get why these systems even exist, you have to go back to August 2005, Hurricane Katrina. As the storm approached the Gulf Coast, the whole nation was watching with concern. But that concern, it quickly turned into shock, and, as this quote perfectly captures, a really deep frustration. The systems we had in place were put to the ultimate test, and they just came up short.
So let's start right there. What actually happens when our best-laid plans are just completely overwhelmed by reality?
Look, Hurricane Katrina was so much more than just a failure of levees. It was a catastrophic failure of preparedness at every single level of government. The physical destruction was just staggering, flooding the historic city of New Orleans, leaving this heartbreaking trail of devastation. But the storm also laid bare these deep, critical flaws in how we as a country prepared for and responded to major disasters.
Over 1,300 people lost their lives, and in the aftermath, when the dust settled, every single report, every investigation, all pointed to the same core problem, a fundamental lack of coordination. You had responders from different agencies, different states, different levels of government who just couldn't communicate effectively. There was no common playbook, no shared structure, and that led to crippling confusion right when clarity was needed most.
The lessons from Katrina and from the attacks of 9/11 before it, they were learned at a terrible, terrible cost. But they led directly to the creation of a new, unified blueprint, one designed specifically to manage chaos and prevent that kind of failure from ever happening again.
So the answer that emerged from all that rubble was something called the National Incident Management System, or NIMS for short. The goal of NIMS is simple, but it's also massive. Get everyone on the same page. It's a standardized framework that allows public and private agencies, we're talking everyone from a local fire department all the way up to a federal agency like FEMA, to work together seamlessly during a crisis.
Okay, so it's really important to get what NIMS is and what it is not. It's not some dusty response plan you just pull off a shelf. It's a whole systematic approach. It's not just for the mega disasters, it's scalable, so it can be used for any incident, big or small. And this is key. It is not a rigid organization chart. It's a flexible set of principles that creates a common operating picture for everyone involved.
All right, so think of it this way. If NIMS is the league's official rulebook that every single team has to follow, then the Incident Command System, or ICS, is the team's on-field command structure for one specific play. ICS is the tool they use on the ground to organize and manage the actual tactical response.
And this is how ICS creates order on the ground. It establishes a really clear, modular command structure. You have the command staff, who are handling public information and safety. And then you've got the general staff. This is like the engine room of the response. Operations is out there doing the work. Planning is thinking 5 steps ahead. Logistics is getting all the stuff where it needs to go. And finance is keeping track of the costs. The point is, everyone knows their job and who they report to. It's designed to eliminate that confusion.
But, just responding to disasters is only half the battle. What about protecting the fundamental services, the actual lifelines of our society in the first place?
And that's where this concept of critical infrastructure comes in. We're talking about the systems we all rely on every single day: power, water, communications, transportation. These are the assets that are so vital that if they go down, the impact on the country is just debilitating. And here's the kicker: a whopping 85% of this infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. So the government has identified 16 of these critical sectors, and the wild thing is how deeply interconnected they all are. I mean, just think about one: healthcare and public health. During a pandemic, a hospital is on the absolute front lines. But for that hospital to even function, it needs the energy sector for electricity, the water sector for clean water, and the communication sector to coordinate with first responders. It's a perfect example of all these hidden dependencies that really tie our nation together.
So how in the world do you protect this complex, interconnected web? Well, that's the job of the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, or NIP. This is the big-picture strategic plan that guides that essential partnership between the government and private industry to manage risks to all those lifelines we just talked about.
The heart of the NIP is this risk management framework, and it's not a one-and-done kind of thing. It's a continuous cycle. You start by setting goals, then you identify what's most critical, you assess the risks, what could go wrong. Then you actually implement programs to reduce those risks. And finally, you measure how well it's all working. And then you start the cycle all over again. It's all about constant learning and adaptation.
Okay, so we have these incredibly detailed, well-designed blueprints on paper. They look great. But the million-dollar question is this: do they actually work in the chaos of a real-world crisis?
Let's focus on the on-the-ground system, ICS. While it's widely praised by so many in the emergency management community, it also has its critics. Some people argue that these kinds of standardized systems can sometimes be too slow, too cumbersome, and just not flexible enough for the sheer uncertainty of a real disaster.
So what does the research tell us? Well, the findings are a bit mixed, and it really seems to come down to the people. On one hand, ICS is proven to be really successful at fostering communication and creating predictable flows of information. But its implementation is often uneven. A key challenge, and this was echoed in the Katrina reports, is that for it to work, everyone involved from all the different agencies has to be trained on the system, and most importantly, they have to buy in and be truly committed to using it.
So the bottom line is this: the blueprint is solid. The system itself can be very effective, but its success in any given disaster depends entirely on the training, the experience, and the commitment of the people who are putting it into practice on the ground.
All right, let's pull all of this together and ask the big question: where do we stand today?
Ultimately, when you look at NIMS, ICS, and the NIP, they represent this monumental effort to learn from the hardest lessons of our recent history. They are the invisible architecture of our national safety net. Now, are they perfect? No, of course not. But they provide an absolutely essential, shared framework to manage chaos, protect our communities, and preserve our way of life when a crisis strikes.
But this leaves us with one final and I think critical question. These systems were forged in the crucible of 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina. They were designed to respond to those types of disasters. But are they agile enough for the threats of tomorrow? I'm talking about sophisticated cyber attacks, the cascading effects of climate change, or another novel pandemic. That's the challenge we face now.